In the depths of Versailles, where mirrors reflected not only the brilliance of gold, but also the hidden shadows of desire, there was a tale whispered only in secret corridors, a tale that was never written in the official chronicles of the Sun King. Louis XIV, who styled himself as the very embodiment of divine majesty, surrounded by endless ceremony and endless prayers, did not live only for war, politics, and glory. Beneath the gilded ceilings and perfumed halls, he created a society of shadows, a chosen circle that called itself the Perfumed Club. It was not merely a gathering of courtiers and mistresses. It was a society where incense was mixed with lust, where perfume masked the odor of sin, and where power fed on the corruption of both body and soul. The Perfumed Club was born in secrecy, its members carefully chosen among courtiers, ladies of high birth, foreign envoys, and hidden priestesses of pleasure, women who were trained not only to delight the flesh but to enact rituals that blurred the line between devotion and debauchery. Within this circle, masks were worn not to hide shame but to liberate it, and names were forgotten, replaced with symbols, scents, and whispered invocations. It was said that the Sun King himself demanded that these rites remain shrouded, for the scandal, if ever revealed, could have shattered the illusion of his godlike authority. Among the many rumors that swirled around Versailles, none was darker than the tale of what occurred within the chapel itself, a space that to all eyes was the holiest part of the palace. Beneath frescoes of angels and saints, beneath the towering organ that thundered with hymns to heaven, there were nights when the chapel ceased to belong to God and became the theater of something else entirely. Witnesses never dared to speak openly, for those who did were silenced, some by exile, some by poison in their goblets, and some by sudden illness that struck too swiftly to be natural. The story tells that during grand ceremonies, when the eyes of the court were dazzled by lit candles and sacred chants, Louis XIV would often withdraw behind the golden lattice that separated the royal tribune from the rest of the faithful. Behind that gilded screen, hidden from the multitude, members of the Perfumed Club awaited him. They came perfumed with ambergris, musk, and rosewater, their bodies draped in silks so thin that they clung like mist to the skin. While priests below intoned psalms and raised the host, the King of France, anointed with sacred oil at his coronation, enacted his own ceremonies that mingled flesh with sacrilege. It was whispered that these acts were not merely of passion, but of ritual. The Perfumed Club believed that pleasure in the very house of God granted the king a power beyond human limits, that to desecrate the holy was to absorb its strength. Some said blood was involved, not of sacrifice upon an altar of stone, but of women who gave themselves entirely, body and soul, to the fire of the Sun King. Their cries, muffled behind music and chant, merged with the sound of prayers, so that no one could say with certainty where the sacred ended and the profane began. The legends grew darker still. A tale, passed from servant to servant, spoke of one night when the king demanded a spectacle that surpassed all others. A nobleman accused of treachery was seized not by guards but by masked women of the Perfumed Club, drugged with wine infused with opium, and carried not to the Bastille but into the chapel itself. There, before the altar, his punishment became part of the ritual. Stripped of his dignity, surrounded by laughter and the perfumed haze of incense, he was offered not a trial but a final humiliation. Some said he was slain, his blood collected in a golden chalice and mixed with wine, which the king raised as though it were the most sacred of sacraments. Others claimed the man lived but was broken, forever silenced by terror, vanishing into the shadows of the palace prisons. In this way, the chapel of Versailles became both temple and theater, both cathedral and lair. The Perfumed Club did not limit itself to pleasures of the flesh. They performed marriages of blasphemy, where daughters were wedded to fathers in mockery of the church, where princes exchanged vows with their sisters, where every law of God and man was inverted. Perfumed oils anointed not the forehead but the hidden places of the body, and where the priest should have spoken of salvation, the king's whisper dictated new commandments born from desire and domination. Those who resisted the Perfumed Club's invitations found their lives made miserable. Men of honor who frowned upon such indulgences discovered their estates burdened with taxes, their families disgraced by sudden scandal, their wives or daughters seduced into the club's orbit until resistance collapsed. Women who refused were shunned, accused of sorcery, and in some cases, disappeared into convents where their silence was assured. Thus the perfumed club grew, not only in secrecy but in power, until it became a hidden court within the court, a dark mirror of Versailles itself. And yet, the greatest irony was that all of this unfolded beneath painted ceilings where angels flew, beneath crucifixes that glimmered in candlelight, beneath the organ that thundered praises to the Almighty. Louis XIV, who had been crowned with sacred oil at Reims and who called himself the most Christian king, allowed his chapel to become a place where the sacred was consumed by lust, where perfume and incense mingled into one intoxicating smoke, where power knew no restraint. This story, whispered and feared, was never written in the official history of France, but in the hidden diaries of courtiers, in the secret memoirs smuggled beyond the walls of Versailles, in the songs of servants who dared to sing when wine loosened their tongues, the legend endured. The chapel that should have been a sanctuary became a stage of corruption, and the perfumed club lived on in rumor, in scandal, in the endless fascination with the shadow that follows absolute power. Even today, when visitors enter Versailles and gaze at the majesty of its chapel, they see only the triumph of Baroque art and royal devotion. But some whisper that if one stands in silence long enough, in the hours when the palace is empty, the air still carries the faintest trace of musk and incense, and the shadows in the tribune move in ways that no candlelight can explain. For in the court of the Sun King, the line between holiness and horror was never more fragile, and the perfume of sin lingers long after the bodies have turned to dust. Continuation of Part 1. The beginning of the perfumed club did not burst forth in glory but crept like incense through hidden corridors, a slow and invisible corruption that spread beneath the radiance of Versailles. It began when Louis XIV, still burning with the fever of youth, sought not only to dominate his enemies on the battlefield but to dominate the very souls of those around him. Court was already a theater of masks, ambition, and whispers, yet the king hungered for something deeper, a society that would obey him not only in politics but in secret desires. Thus was planted the first seed of what would become the perfumed brotherhood, a union of lust, intrigue, and ritual. Its earliest members were chosen not in the open halls of Versailles but in private chambers veiled with silk and guarded by silence. At first they were courtiers who had proven their loyalty by indulging the king's whims without question. Then women whose beauty was matched by cunning, women capable of bending rivals with a glance or a smile perfumed with rare essences from the East. To them were added perfumers, masters of hidden knowledge, who could craft not only fragrances but potions that clouded reason and loosened flesh from restraint. These alchemists were as feared as they were desired, for they knew how to turn the air itself into a drug, weaving together musk, amber, and narcotic resins until passion flared like fire in the blood. It was the perfumers who taught the club the art of incense. They showed that smoke was more than fragrance. It was power. Burning herbs and resins could weaken the will, disarm suspicion, and stir forbidden hunger. Soon, incense became the very soul of the brotherhood, the veil behind which sin was sanctified. Under its haze, faces blurred, identities dissolved, and those who entered the ritual chamber ceased to be lords or ladies, priests or servants. They became vessels for the king's will, bound by scent, united in secrecy. Spies were also drawn into the brotherhood, for no secret society can survive without eyes and ears. They watched courtiers, priests, and ambassadors, noting who might be tempted, who might be broken, who might be silenced. Those who resisted were ruined by rumor, their downfall arranged with precision. Those who yielded found themselves drawn into the perfumed mist, bound forever by knowledge of what they had seen and done. Thus the brotherhood grew, feeding upon both desire and fear. The ladies of the court played their role with deadly elegance. Trained in both allure and cruelty, they were more than companions. They were instruments of the king's dominion. They carried perfumes hidden in crystal vials, each scent crafted to awaken specific passions. They anointed themselves not with holy oils but with essences that enslaved the senses of men, until reason was drowned in hunger. Their task was not only to please but to ensnare, to weave chains of seduction around those whom the king wished to bind. It was within this labyrinth of perfumes, poisons, and pleasures that whispers first spoke of the chapel. The thought arose that if incense could enthrall in chambers, how much greater would its power be when mingled with sacred smoke rising before the altar of God. To sin in private chambers was to indulge desire, but to sin in the house of the divine was to claim a higher dominion, to turn holiness itself into a tool of the Sun King. Thus the chapel, at first untouchable, became the final and most desired stage for the Brotherhood's rites. When the first secret ritual was attempted within its walls, it was not yet the full debauchery that later generations whispered about. It was a test, an experiment in which perfumers burned rare incense during a late-night mass, incense laced with narcotic vapors brought from the east. Those present swayed not only with piety but with dizziness, their prayers thick with confusion, their eyes glazed as though intoxicated by the divine. The courtiers who stood closest to the king fell under his spell more completely than ever before, and he saw the potential of this new weapon. It was no longer simple lust or pleasure. It was power, the kind that reshaped minds and erased boundaries between sacred and profane. Thus the perfumed club was born, not only of flesh but of smoke, secrecy, and ritual. It was a society that dressed itself in luxury while hiding its true face, a brotherhood bound by scent and silence. And in its beginning lay the promise of what it would become, a force that would turn Versailles into a palace of shadows, where perfume masked blood, where incense concealed sin, and where the chapel itself became the throne of sacrilege. Continuation of Part 2. The royal chapel of Versailles stood in the eyes of the world as the most sacred jewel of the palace, a temple of divine majesty where the king himself would kneel as the most Christian monarch. Its marble columns gleamed with purity, its vaults rose toward heaven, and its golden altar seemed to reflect the very light of God. Yet beneath this vision of sanctity there was another face, hidden behind veils of incense and guarded by shadows. The chapel was not only a temple but a stage of flesh, not only a house of prayer but a brothel consecrated to the desires of Louis XIV. The transformation began in silence, under the careful guidance of architects and masons who were sworn not by oaths of loyalty but by threats of death. Secret compartments were built into the very walls, lattices constructed not only for music and air but for hidden eyes. Chambers were concealed behind carved woodwork where the perfumed club could prepare in secrecy, and passages opened behind altars that allowed chosen companions to slip in unseen. Candles burned brighter on feast days, but among their flames were others scented with exotic resins that clouded the mind. Where once the incense of the church rose to heaven, now mingled vapors carried both prayer and lust into the air. The chapel was guarded more fiercely than any treasure room, for its sanctity was the mask of its corruption. Musketeers loyal to the king stood at its doors during rituals, turning away even high-born courtiers under the pretense of guarding the monarch's privacy in prayer. Those who questioned too much were reassigned to distant posts, their absence explained by illness or sudden orders of war. A wall of silence surrounded the chapel, maintained not only by soldiers but by the very priests who should have cried out against the blasphemy. They remained silent, some bound by fear, others seduced by the king's gold, and a few enticed into the perfumed brotherhood themselves. For even among holy men, there were those who found in incense and ritual a temptation stronger than faith. It was during the night that the true face of the chapel was revealed. When the court slept and corridors grew silent, the king's chosen would gather in the galleries, masked and perfumed, their footsteps muffled by carpets and shadow. The altar, draped in gold, became a throne of desire. The organ, which by day thundered with hymns to the Almighty, now poured out music twisted into strange harmonies, melodies that seemed to blur devotion into delirium. The walls, painted with saints, looked down in silent witness as their holy images were veiled by smoke. These evenings were not acts of simple indulgence. They were ceremonies, carefully constructed to mirror the rites of the church but turned inside out, sanctity perverted into ecstasy. The perfumed club arranged themselves as though at mass, kneeling, chanting, and lifting their hands, yet the object of their worship was not God but Louis himself. He stood where the priest should stand, anointed not with sacred oil but with essences prepared by perfumers and alchemists, oils mixed with musk and narcotics that shone upon his skin like liquid fire. His body became the altar, his flesh the host, his desire the law. Women approached as though taking communion, but what they received was not bread nor wine. Men bowed as though confessing sins, yet what they confessed was not guilt but hunger for corruption. Incense filled the air, a smoke so heavy that the mind faltered and the senses drowned. Some swore that within its haze they saw visions, that angels on the ceiling frescoes wept tears of blood, that shadows took the shape of demons watching from the corners. Others spoke of hearing voices, not of priests chanting psalms but of whispers in forgotten tongues, words that seemed older than the chapel itself. Whether these were hallucinations from the vapors or signs of something darker, none could tell, but all were consumed by the same frenzy that bound the brotherhood together. On certain nights, the rites went further still. Women were crowned with wreaths of roses and paraded before the altar as living offerings, their bodies painted with gold leaf, their skin glowing in candlelight as though they were statues of pagan goddesses. Men were made to kneel in chains, their noble titles stripped away, their voices raised in chants that praised not the Trinity but the eternal majesty of Louis. Some rituals ended in ecstasy, others in blood. There were whispers that sacrifices were offered, not of lambs but of men and women deemed traitors, their deaths cloaked beneath incense and song, their cries drowned beneath the roar of the organ. And yet the chapel remained untouchable in the eyes of the world. Ambassadors from foreign courts entered its doors by day and saw only magnificence. Priests preached sermons as though nothing lay beneath the marble floors. Courtiers admired its beauty and spoke of the piety of their king. None dared to utter the truth, for the truth was heavier than death. Those who came too close to it vanished, their names erased, their memory silenced. Thus the royal chapel of Versailles, the supposed heart of holiness in the Sun King's palace, lived a double life. To the court it was a temple. To the brotherhood it was a brothel sanctified by ritual and smoke. Within its walls the boundary between heaven and hell dissolved, and what was meant to glorify God became instead the throne of sin. The Perfumed Club had claimed the most sacred place of the kingdom and turned it into their dominion. And in the stillness of night, the chapel echoed not with hymns but with the secret moans and cries of worship that no priest would dare to record. Continuation Part 3. The mask of piety that Louis XIV had so carefully woven around himself began to crack not with thunder but with whispers. Versailles was a palace of eyes and ears, a place where every step was mirrored, every glance noted, every silence remarked upon. For years the Perfumed Club had thrived within smoke and secrecy, hiding its rituals behind the brilliance of gold and the hymns of the chapel. Yet no mask lasts forever, and the greater the illusion, the more terrible its collapse. It began with murmurs among servants who had seen too much. A maid who carried perfumed oils into the chapel at night, a guard who was ordered to stand watch while strange chants echoed within, a musician who swore that the organ had played unholy melodies while the rest of the palace slept. These murmurs, passed in kitchens and stables, grew into rumors, and rumors traveled faster than any soldier of the king. At first, they were dismissed as common slander, for who could believe that the most Christian king would desecrate his own chapel? But the whispers did not fade. They multiplied, spreading into Paris, into noble salons, and into the confessional boxes of frightened priests. The danger became real when courtiers themselves began to speak. Some had been drawn into the Perfumed Club unwillingly, blackmailed or drugged by incense until they too took part in the rites. Their consciences became poisoned wounds, and in moments of drunkenness or despair, they confessed what they had seen. A few wrote their testimonies in secret letters, hoping to preserve their honor before God. Others sought allies in the church, begging for absolution. But the walls of Versailles were merciless, and the king's spies heard all. One by one, those who spoke too loudly vanished. Some were exiled to remote estates, where they withered in obscurity. Some were imprisoned in fortresses where no visitor was allowed. And some died suddenly, struck down by fevers or collapsing after a single sip of wine, their lips stained by poison before they could utter another word. The poisonings themselves became the great scandal of the age. The affair of the poisons spread terror through Paris, unmasking a world of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and dealers of deadly powders. Among the accused names, the shadow of Madame de Montespan loomed largest. She had once been the king's favorite, the mistress whose beauty and wit had enthroned her as queen in all but name. Yet when her star began to fade, the whispers grew darker. It was said she had sought magical rites to hold the king's love, that she had employed priests of shadow to perform black masses upon her body, that the incense which once perfumed the chapel was mixed with powders meant not only to inflame desire but to enslave it. The tribunal investigating the poisonings uncovered testimonies that linked the mistress herself to sacrilege. Witnesses claimed to have seen her upon an altar, naked and anointed with oils, while prayers twisted into curses were spoken over her. They swore that blood had been spilled in her presence, the blood of infants offered to secure her hold upon the king. Though the court moved swiftly to suppress these revelations, the damage was done. Montespan's name was forever stained, and she was cast aside, retreating into exile while the king sought to erase her memory from the chronicles. Yet the shadow remained. Too many threads of rumor connected the perfumed club, the chapel, and the poisoning scandals. Too many sudden deaths of courtiers aligned with the rise and fall of those within the brotherhood. Though no open trial was ever held against the king himself, France buzzed with suspicion. Pamphlets circulated in secret, painting Versailles not as a palace of glory but as a den of lust and blasphemy. Priests whispered from pulpits that divine wrath would one day fall upon those who had mocked the sacred rites. Nobles who smiled in the king's presence cursed him in private, fearing that the kingdom itself was poisoned at its heart. Louis, sensing the danger, cloaked himself once more in rigid ceremony. He multiplied his appearances at public masses, displayed his devotion in grand processions, and commissioned works of art that painted him as a new David, a chosen servant of God. Yet the more he proclaimed his holiness, the more the hidden truth festered. The chapel continued to glitter, but those who looked closely swore that its marble was stained, that beneath the polish of gold one could still smell the mingled perfumes of lust and incense. The fall of the mask of piety was not a single event but a slow unraveling. The king never confessed, the perfumed club was never named, and the chronicles of the court were purged of scandal. Yet history remembers in other ways. The contrast between the radiant image of the Sun King, the father of art, of music, of divine order, and the shadows that whispered of sacrilege and sin, became a legend darker than any truth. For it showed how power, when absolute, devours not only kingdoms but souls. And so, when posterity gazes upon Versailles, they see a palace of light, a monarch crowned with glory, and a chapel that rises as the crown of faith. Yet beneath that splendor lies the story whispered across centuries, that the same hand which signed edicts and led armies also anointed itself in oils of lust, that the same lips which invoked God in public drank from chalices of blood in secret, that the Sun King himself built a throne not only upon marble and gold but upon incense, poison, and the cries of those who dared to speak the truth. The perfumed club vanished into silence, its members dead, disgraced, or forgotten, but its shadow lingers still. It is said that at night, when the palace grows silent, the chapel exhales its hidden past, the air still thick with the phantom smoke of incense, the faint perfume of corruption that no centuries can erase. And in that silence the mask of piety crumbles, revealing not a sainted king but a man of flesh, a ruler whose divine radiance was forever stained by the darkness he tried to hide.